The name Africa is a lie, not a mistake, not an oversight, a deliberate erasure of identity that has lasted 2,000 years. We will uncover the original names that were spoken here long before any Roman ever set foot on African soil. Names have power. When you control what people call themselves, you control how they think about themselves. And for 2 millennia, Africa has been thinking about itself through the eyes of its colonizers. Contemporary scholarship has intensified the debate over Africa's name. In 2024, University of Pretoria Professor Jonathan Okeke Chimakonam and his co-authors published research arguing that Africa constitutes a racial slur that should be abandoned. Their analysis connects the Greek Afrik, which means without code, to the systematic color categorization of humanity that emerged in 18th century European universities, particularly in Germany. Chimakonam's team proposed Anasia as an alternative, derived from Igbo words which means place of origin. This proposal reflects growing academic interest in decolonizing African nomenclature and restoring indigenous identity markers. In 2025, South Africa's African Transformation Movement formally proposed changing the country's name to Republic of Azania. At the continental level, the Alkebulan revivalist movement continues advocating for adoption of Alkebulan as the continent's authentic name. Let me start with what we know for sure. The Romans conquered Carthage in 146 BCE. They carved up North Africa into provinces: Africa Proconsularis, or Old Africa, and Africa Nova, meaning New Africa. But here's what's crucial. They were only talking about a region roughly the size of modern Tunisia. The vast continent we call Africa today, the Romans had no idea that it even existed. For 1,500 years after that conquest, Africa meant just that small slice of the so-called North Africa. The rest of the continent had its own names, its own identity, dozens of regional names that reflected the incredible diversity of African civilizations. It wasn't until European colonial expansion in the 1600s that anyone thought to call the entire continent Africa. Think about that. For most of human history, the people living here never called their homeland by the name we use today. Now, where did Africa actually come from? The Romans themselves weren't sure. Some claimed it honored the Afri tribe living near Carthage, possibly a Berber group. Others suggested it came from the Latin word aprica, meaning sunny. But here's what's telling. There's no solid evidence in Roman sources that they actually called it Africa Terra, meaning the land of the Afri. That might be a later invention by historians trying to make sense of a name whose origins were already forgotten. But there's another theory, one that changes everything. Gerald Massey, and for those of us who haven't heard of this gentleman, he's a great historian. Studying Egyptian texts in 1881, proposed that Africa comes from the ancient Egyptian phrase of Afrika, meaning to turn toward the opening of the Ka. The Ka was the spiritual double, the life force in Egyptian or Kemetic belief systems. If Massey was right, then even the name Africa has African origins. It's a corruption of an ancient Egyptian or Kemetic spiritual concept. Let me take you back further. As the great African scholar Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop revealed through his meticulous research, Egyptians had only one term to designate themselves, Kemtu, which literally means the blacks. This is the strongest term existing in the pharaonic tongue to indicate blackness. The term is a collective noun that describes the whole people of pharaonic Egypt as black people. Professor Theophile Obenga, standing alongside Job at the historic 1974 UNESCO Cairo Symposium, confirmed this truth that had been buried under centuries of Eurocentric distortion. These two African giants stood alone against a room full of European scholars who could not accept the obvious, that the builders of the pyramids, the creators of the hieroglyphs, the masters of mathematics and astronomy were black African people who proudly called themselves Kemtu. The Kemtu were not referring to soil when they spoke of their identity. They were proclaiming their blackness, their African heritage, their connection to the cosmic forces that flow through melanin-rich skin. When they said Kemet, they were declaring, we are the black people, the original people, the first nation. But the people of Kemet weren't the only ones with names for their territories. When Herodotus traveled through North Africa around 450 BCE, he wrote about Libya, everything south of the Mediterranean and west of the Nile. This wasn't just a Greek invention. The name Libya comes from Libu, an ancient Berber tribe. The Egyptians wrote it in hieroglyphs as LBW. Indigenous African peoples had their own names for their lands. The Greeks also used Ethiopia, from Aethiops, meaning burnt face, a compound of aetho, meaning I burn, and ops, referring to face. They weren't being poetic, they were describing what they saw. People with dark skin, darker than their own. Aristotle wrote that Egyptians were not just black, but very black. When the Arabs arrived in the 7th century, they brought their own naming system. They called the region south of Egypt Bilad al-Sudan, the land of the blacks. This wasn't casual terminology. Medieval Arabic geographers used Sudan to describe the entire belt of Africa between the Sahara and the forested regions further south, from the Senegal River to the Red Sea. Each of these names tells us something about how different peoples understood Africa. The Greeks focused on geography and physical appearance. The Arabs acknowledged racial and cultural distinctions, but none used Africa to describe the continent as a whole. That brings us to the scholars who changed how we understand all of this. Dr. Yosef Ben Yochanan, or affectionately called Dr. Ben to those who knew him, spent decades researching African history. He led educational tours to Egypt and Sudan that he called Dr. Ben's Al-Kabilan educational tours. Al-Kabilan, he argued, was the ancient indigenous name for Africa, meaning Mother of Mankind, or Garden of Eden. Dr. Ben wasn't just making claims. He was part of a generation of African and African-American scholars who refused to accept the colonial narrative. They dug deep into primary sources, learned ancient languages, and challenged every assumption about African history. The most revolutionary of these scholars was Sheikh Anta Diop, the Senegalese physicist and historian. Diop didn't just argue that ancient Egypt was African, he proved it. He used melanin skin testing to demonstrate that ancient Egyptian mummies had the same skin pigmentation as modern-day so-called sub-Saharan Africans. He studied linguistics to show connections between ancient Egyptian and modern African languages. In his Kemetic History of Africa, Diop wrote, the ancient name of Africa was Al-Kabilan. Al-Kabilan means Mother of Mankind or Garden of Eden. He claimed in his works that this name was used by Ethiopians, Nubians, Moors, and Numidians, by indigenous African peoples themselves before any foreign conquest or colonial naming. Diop faced fierce opposition from Western academics. They attacked his methods, questioned his credentials, dismissed his findings, but he persisted because he understood something fundamental. The fight over African history wasn't just academic, It was about the right of African peoples to define themselves. Théophile Obenga, the Congolese linguist that took Job's work further, Obenga used comparative linguistics. He challenged the Kamito-Semitic language family classification that separated ancient Egyptian from other African languages. I remember reading Obenga's account of a conference in Barcelona where he faced off against the Western linguist who used computers to compare ancient Egyptian and so-called Semitic languages. The computer found many words that didn't match, marking them as blanks. Obenga told that linguist, "I am more intelligent than your computer. Where it marks blank, I will fill it in." And he did, showing connections the computer didn't recognize. John Henrik Clark, the African-American historian, put this all in perspective. Clark co-founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity with Malcolm X. He understood that the fight for African history was part of a larger struggle for dignity and self-determination, the first light of human consciousness, and the world's first civilizations were in Africa. Clark wrote, he knew that controlling the narrative of the past was crucial for controlling the future. These scholars weren't just academics. They were revolutionaries fighting to restore African people's understanding of their own heritage. They faced ridicule, academic ostracism, and political pressure, but they persisted because they knew that identity matters, that names have power, that knowing your true history is the foundation of freedom. Now, let's be honest about the controversies. Not all historians accept the Alkebulan theory. Some argue there's insufficient evidence that this name was widely used across the continent. Critics point out that most evidence comes from scholars who might be motivated by politics rather than pure academic inquiry. But here's what's undeniable. The current name Africa is definitely not African in origin. Whether you believe in Alkebulan or prefer Kemet or accept any other indigenous name, the fact remains that 1.4 billion people are living on a continent named by their colonizers. Think about what that means psychologically. China calls itself Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom. India calls itself Bharat. But Africa still uses a name given by Roman colonizers 2,000 years ago. This represents an ongoing mental colonization that affects how Africans see themselves and how the world sees Africa. The linguistic evidence reveals the pattern of this erasure. We have climate-based names imposed by outsiders. Africa meaning sunny, Africa without cold. We have appearance names, Ethiopia, burnt faces, Sudan, land of blacks. We have tribal names adopted by conquerors, Libya from the Libu tribe, possibly Africa from the Afri tribe. But we also have indigenous names that reflect African peoples' understanding of their own lands. Kemet, the black land, Alkebulan, mother of mankind. These names emphasize life, fertility, humanity's origins, not just physical appearance or climate. The transformation of naming patterns tells the story of colonization itself. In ancient times, we have indigenous names like Kemet and claimed names like Alkebulan. In classical times, we get Greek and Roman impositions like Libya, Ethiopia, Africa. In the Islamic period, we see Arabic designations, Sudan or Bilad al-Sudan. In the colonial period, we get European categorizations, Guinea, based on racial distinctions. Finally, in the modern period, we see Africa imposed on the entire continent, a Roman name stretched to cover a landmass the Romans never even knew existed. This isn't just about names, it's about the right of peoples to define themselves. When Job wrote, "Intellectuals ought to study the past, not for the pleasure they find in so doing, but to derive lessons from it," he was talking about this exact issue. The lesson is clear. Those who control the narrative control the future. Dr. Ben understood this when he said Africa was not asleep. Africa was wide awake, but her land, as well as her sons and daughters, were subjected to the most barbarous treatment man has ever inflicted upon his fellow man. He wasn't just talking about physical colonization, he was talking about mental colonization, the theft of identity itself. Dr. Clark put it even more directly. Powerful people cannot afford to educate the people they oppress, because once you are truly educated, you will not ask for power, you will take it. Part of true education is understanding how names shape consciousness, how identity affects destiny. So what was Africa's original name? The honest answer is that there wasn't just one. This vast, diverse continent had hundreds of names reflecting its incredible cultural richness. Kemet in the Nile Valley, Alkebulan among various peoples, if the scholars are right, Libya among the Berbers, local names amongst thousands of ethnic groups and kingdoms. But here's what we know for certain: Africa isn't one of them. It is obviously a colonial imposition that has lasted for centuries, so deeply embedded that even questioning it seems radical. The scholars we've discussed today dedicated their lives to uncovering these truths. They faced opposition, ridicule, academic exile, etc. But they persisted because they understood that identity matters, that names have power, that knowing your true history is the first step toward controlling your future. Whether Africa should reclaim an indigenous name like Alkebulan or has grown into its colonial designation is a question for Africans themselves to answer. But we should at least acknowledge the truth. The motherland of humanity deserves better than a name given by its conquerors. The evidence is there in ancient texts, in hieroglyphic inscriptions, in the work of scholars who refused to accept the colonial narrative. Africa was never asleep. It was wide awake, creating, naming, defining itself long before Romans or Greeks or Arabs or Europeans arrived to impose their own understanding. It's time the rest of the world woke up to that reality. Thank you for joining me. Remain black and proud.
We begin our journey in the Great Lakes region of Africa. The Anu, migrants from the Great Lakes region, were the first settlers of the Nile Valley. The first written scripts were found in Abydos and dated to about 3400 BCE. These predate the cuneiform script of Sumer by at least 2 centuries. The Scorpion King was a ruler of Upper Kemet in the pre-dynastic period. The first dynasty covers the first series of kings to rule over a unified Kemet, the Old Kingdom. It is also known as the Age of the Pyramids, encompasses the reigns of the great pyramid builders such as Khufu and Khafra. The Kerma culture was based in the southern part of Nubia, or Upper Nubia, in parts of present-day northern and central Sudan. The Middle Kingdom started from the reunification of Egypt under the reign of Mentuhotep II in the 11th dynasty to the end of the 12th dynasty. Thutmose III attacked Nubia, but only went so far as the 4th cataract of the Nile.